Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's event, Findings from Centering the Picture, a Slover Linett Report on Culture and Community. My name is Caitlin Zachary, and I'm the Manager of Programs and Resources at the Association of Performing Arts Professionals. Closed captioning will appear automatically on your screen. If you would like to disable the chat transcript, please click More on the bottom of your Zoom window and click on Hide Subtitle as indicated on the slide. APAP is located in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and the Anacostan people, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I would like to pay my respect to the Piscataway and Anacostan elders, both past and present. In addition to the Zoom platform, we are also broadcasting today's webinar on Facebook Live. During today's webinar, Zoom participants will have the opportunity to ask questions and provide comments using the Q&A and chat functions. Unfortunately, we will not be taking questions or comments via Facebook Live. If you have questions, we ask that you submit them using the Q&A box. APAP welcomes the open exchange of ideas at our events. The views expressed by our speakers or participants in this webinar are those of the speaker or participant and not necessarily of APAP. I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's webinar. It's Krista Bradley, the Director of Programs and Resources here at APAP. Welcome, Krista.
Sorry. Thanks, Caitlin, and welcome everybody to, whoops. Can y'all hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Alrighty. Thanks, Caitlin, and welcome everyone. As Caitlin said, I'm Krista Bradley. I'm the Director of Programs and Resources at APAP. I go by the pronoun she, her, and I am a brown-skinned Black woman wearing a pink headband and a black and white polka dot top, and I'm sitting in front of a bunch of plants and a Peloton. I am so pleased to welcome our panelists today, friends and wonderful colleagues in the research community, and also colleagues of ours with partners of the Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, the Wallace Foundation, and our wonderful funders of so much of our communications and audience and engagement work. Today we have Melody Buchazar-Dawkins. Melody is a researcher at Slover Linett Audience Research. She has worked with clients such as the Library of Congress, Signature Theater, Whippoorwill Art, StoryCorps, as well as Slover Linett's Collaborative National Studies, Culture and Community in a Time of Crisis, a special COVID edition of Culture Track, and a qualitative subphase of Culture and Community in a Time of Transformation, which you'll hear much more about today. Melody brings together doctoral training as a developmental psychologist and science communicator with experience in labor organizing, focusing on issues of fairness, access, and equity. Using both quantitative and qualitative methods, her research philosophy prioritizes a community-based participatory approach to bring the margins to the mainstream via social research. Ultimately, Melody aims to work on supporting arts and cultural organizations in becoming more equitable, community-oriented, and relevant to diverse audiences. Joining Melody is Jen Benoit Bryan, PhD. Jen is the Vice President and Co-Director of Research at Slover Linett, a firm that uses the tools of research and evaluation to help the cultural sector understand its participants and communities, as well as experiment with new strategies for engagement and connect more deeply to more people. Jen has overseen a portfolio of complex client engagements over the past 7 years at Slover Linett, using the tools of research and evaluation to help organizations meet their goals. We are very happy to have her join us today. And Jen serves as the principal investigator and Slover Linett team director for this project that you'll hear more about, which was conducted in 2020 and 2021 in partnership with LaPlaca, Cohen, and Yancey Consulting. So I'd like to welcome Melody and Jen to our virtual stage right now and get them to put their cameras on. And thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you both.
Thanks for the lovely introduction, Krista. We're so delighted to be here with all of you today.
Oh, it's great. So we're so intrigued by the work that you've been doing, and many of our members might be familiar with your work in audience research. Many may not be. So I think it might be really helpful to just learn a little bit more about Slover Linett and the work that you've been doing around audience research. And then I'd like to just share a little bit of context for our members and explain why we felt like this research was important as we move through and reopen, given the twin pandemics that we've just been moving through. So can you give us a little background, Jen?
I will, yeah, I'd be delighted to. So Slover Linett is a 20-year-old firm based in Chicago, and we're a team of between 10 and 15, depending on kind of where we are in the fluctuation of the year, that are all really passionate about change in the arts and culture sector. And we work pretty broadly across that sector with visual arts, performing arts, science and science communication. And the tools that we bring to all of those different parts of the sector are really a curiosity about how to deepen and broaden engagement. And so one of the things that we almost always are recommending is talking both to current audiences or visitors or participants, but also to be thinking more broadly about your community and thinking about what that means, what community means to you as an organization and how that's defined. It's something we're really excited and passionate about, and it's something we've been able to bring in different forms to lots of different performing arts organizations over the past few years, including the Kennedy Center, who we work with on an annual basis to really understand the range of their different audiences and platforms. We work with the Met Opera very in a focused way, just really around their digital platform and digital engagement, how to deepen that and extend it. We've worked recently with Signature Theater, as Melody mentioned, on a great study we're going to be sharing more about in our blog soon about welcome and belonging and the dimensions of that, particularly for Black or African American and Hispanic or Latinx New Yorkers. And then Melody's the lead researcher on this amazing study with Whippoorwill Arts around musicians and how they might need support during this particularly difficult time of crisis over the last year and moving forward. So just a smattering of the kinds of ways we engage across the performing arts sector.
All critically important and really, really timely work. So thank you for that grounding. So, you know, just we all know what this great pause has done for our field. So many organizations have been decimated. And trying to find ways to stay intact, as well as also discovering pathways of innovation. And whether it was finding ways to connect with new audiences or realizing that there was an audience that they'd never actually engaged digitally. And so it's been both really challenging, but also a time of innovation. And I think you know, we've heard stories from our members about ways that they've rediscovered their own organization and the role that they play in the community, being tapped by the community to meet needs that maybe go beyond the arts, but really are about human connection and belonging. So I think this data resonates a lot with even the anecdotal things that we've been hearing in the field. And I guess as we're all preparing to reopen, some of us are already open, we're coming back to the work with fewer dollars, but with greater commitment and awareness about how we have not always connected to communities in the ways that we thought we were, or we've had our own racial reckoning or been called in and out by our communities and our colleagues about what we're doing or not doing enough in terms of working with and alongside BIPOC artists, programming, and BIPOC communities or leaders even in our staff. So, you know, this sense of insight that you're bringing around BIPOC communities and their expression and their sharing of how they engaged in the arts and what they expect of cultural organizations is really timely and important. So I just wanted to provide that kind of overview and connect the dots a bit for our folks. And many of you all are familiar with APAP's READY work, our racial equity, diversity, inclusion work, but also our 10-20-30 pledge, which really is a pledge for equity and gender equity and calls in folks to consider how to use their resources to better align with and support BIPOC communities. So this is also really well connected to our 10-20-30 pledge. So with that, I'll hand over the mic and ask you to sort of walk us through the research and how it emerged and what you learned.
Sure, great. Thanks for those connections, Krista. There are themes that will come up again in these slides, and we really encourage questions or Q&A thoughts, reflections. We'd love for this to be more of a dialogue, so please don't hesitate to participate. Great. Okay, so this is a really exciting opportunity for Melodea and I, in part because we are bringing to bear on this conversation two different methods and approaches to some broad questions that we're curious about as a firm. So I'll be sharing more insights around the quantitative survey data that we did in Wave 1, as well as a few sneak peeks from the data that just came out of the field for Wave 2 of this culture and community research. And Melody will be focused on the qualitative interviews that have wrapped up a couple of months ago with Black and African American participants across the country. So kind of two waves of different ways to triangulate in on some of the questions that have emerged here. I want to start by acknowledging the many funders and supporters of this work that have made it possible, including an initial commitment from the Wallace Foundation that really anchored this work in Wave 1, as well as the Barr Foundation, who's a main funder for the second wave of the work, and then many other foundations that have come in to support and broaden the scope of what we can explore here, including the Tara Foundation, the William Penn Foundation. IMLS is supporting a library-specific report, which will be great. And then industry partners, including NORC, Microsoft, and Focus Vision. We're also partnering really extensively and collaboratively with LaPlaca Cohen and Yancey Consulting on this, and consider them co-equal partners in the work that we're creating here. We just happen to be two Slover Linett representatives today, but it could just as easily have been our colleagues from those firms. Just a little bit of context here on how the project got started. Back in February of 2020, as we were starting to see COVID emerge as a force and realizing not the extent of the damage that it would cause, but realizing that it would be an important force to reckon with for arts and culture organizations across the country. In colleagueship and in conversation with LaPlaca Cohen and our colleagues there, we talked about creating a survey to really help organizations get a handle on the ways that they might support both their audiences, but also the community more broadly during this time. I will say that the study was fielded for the first wave of this quantitative research in May of 2020, before the murder of George Floyd. And while we were bringing a focus around discussions of race and racism, from the beginning of this project, that really pivoted the way that we thought about the focus of this research in pretty important ways to really deepen the equity and justice focus for that first wave, but also for the research that Melody will be talking about and the Wave 2 research. Just to give you a little bit of that very broad lay of the land, as I mentioned, that first wave of the research was conducted in May of 2020. So that's culture and community in a time of crisis. And then under the 2021 umbrella, we have shifted the name of the research to really be about a time of transformation. And that includes both the qualitative research and the second wave, which was fielded a year after that first wave of research. So I'm going to start us off with some discussion of this first wave of quantitative research, and in particular, really focusing in on the lens of race and ethnicity in how we think about cultural engagement and the needs of communities during COVID. Again, we have all of these people who are part of this project, so I just want to acknowledge the fact that there are other researchers and team members at Slover Linett that are contributing, also partners at Yancey Consulting and LaPlaca Cohen, and then we have an advisory board of 20 members for this first wave, all across the arts and cultural sector with many different layers of expertise who all played a role in this, so very much a community effort. This study emerged as originally planned. We wanted to make sure that we were talking to two different kinds of audiences. We were curious about the people engaging in arts and culture across the country already, who might be on the lists of arts and culture organizations. And in part, we wanted to make sure that we were providing useful, actionable information to any organization that worked with us on this research so that they could look both at their own respondents and see how they fit into the national picture and contribute to that national picture. So that's one piece of this, but we also wanted to think about the general public more broadly, who may or may not have relationships with former arts and culture. And so we also think of that as a separate audience here of the general public. And when we combined those two, we had 2,000 from this nationally representative sample of the US population, and then actually 122,000 people across the country who participated in this Wave 1 survey. Much larger scale than we ever anticipated. We had over 650 organizations who sent the survey out to a portion of their lists, including a huge cohort in performing arts with over 280 organizations across the performing arts field sharing this out. Definitely went from what we expected might be 50 organizations participating to 650 pretty quickly, which I think demonstrated the deep need for information that so many arts and culture organizations were grappling with. We'll say that all the figures that I'm going to share with you have combined these two samples into one overall sample that uses the general public framework as a sample so that we can make sure that everything that we're reporting on has been weighted to be fully representative of the US general population. So all the numbers I'm sharing, you don't need to worry about whether or not they're overrepresented by list respondents. Those have been weighted to be brought back into proportion with the US. And before we dive into those, I want to pause and acknowledge the extent to which there is a strong representation gap in the audiences and the community networks of many cultural organizations, at least those who participated in this first wave of the research. That when we compared the unweighted list respondents, so people who came in through the invitations of all of these arts and cultural organizations to the US adult population that we got through census information, we see really huge gaps in terms of representation, particularly for Black or African Americans, the 9% gap, and Hispanic or Latinx with an 11% gap. Whereas at the bottom, we see white or Caucasians are way overrepresented among this population. Okay, so an invitation to change. We want to start with the juiciest bits here, and I think these are particularly important to really dive into together. So one of the questions that we asked on the survey was about the extent to which people were hopeful that arts and culture organizations in their area would change after the pandemic to be more relevant to people like them. And right off the bat, we see pretty big differences across racial or ethnic groups in the extent to which there is this hope for change among arts or culture organizations. Asian or Pacific Islanders, Black or African Americans, and Hispanic or Latinx are much more likely than the overall and way more likely than white or Caucasians to express a high desire for change. And we think that that data really supports longstanding concerns about systemic bias in who cultural organizations are primarily speaking to and serving. We broke that out a little bit further to think about what kinds of change would people want to make arts and culture organizations better for Americans. And the trend that we saw was towards much greater inclusivity, towards a desire for more casual enjoyment, and towards people really wanting content that was more reflective and innovative. Those are the three main categories of change. Within each of those categories, there's somewhere between 3 and 8 different items that are all combining towards this broader category. For inclusivity and community, which you can see was desired most extensively across every race and ethnicity, but particularly among multiracial Americans and Asian or Pacific Islanders and Native Americans. That included things, a really wide range of things, including serving a broader, diverse range of participants or community members. It included things like being fair and equitable in your treatment of staff, engaging deeply with local artists, engaging with young people in your communities, a lot of really deeply community-based measures of inclusivity. And when we take a step back and think about the ways that arts and culture organizations can serve communities during the crisis, I've chosen one here to really highlight, but there are a number of them in the full report that are available for more, for more exploration if you're interested. Is really around healing, grieving, and processing your emotions. And we can see that the desire for arts and culture organizations to play that role in people's lives is much higher among many BIPOC groups than it is among white or Caucasians. And we can see that coming out in other ways too, that there's also greater emphasis on sort of social, civic, emotional, creative expression roles of cultural participation. We see much higher personal creative activities among Hispanic or Latinx Americans than most of the other groups. there's a lot of really interesting examples of where a particular race and ethnicity has different desires or needs from arts and culture organizations compared to others. I will say that just dropping a little bit of a preview from the Wave 2 findings, even though we found that there were pretty widespread negative emotional impacts of the crisis in Wave 1 around not feeling connected to others, around feeling more sad or depressed and more angry. We found that in Wave 2, those kinds of emotional impacts of COVID have actually deepened and worsened compared to 1 month into the crisis. And so I just want to highlight the fact that there is potentially a strong role for arts or culture organizations to play in being a community hub that's focused on processing and creating a space of healing, and that the need for that is perhaps even greater now than when we first measured this a year ago. So a few dimensions of participation and inclusion here that we thought were particularly interesting. The first one is really about the extent to which people think arts and culture organizations are important. And here we're doing a few comparisons. We're comparing across race and ethnicity, which are the different colors of the bars, but we're also comparing between what people said in terms of the importance of arts and culture before the pandemic versus during the pandemic. So before is the bolder colors and during is the lighter colors to the right. And we weren't sure what we would find here. I think I might have expected we might see that people sort of degree to which they thought arts and culture was important might go down during the pandemic when so many other things were of really deep importance to people. But we found that for almost every race or ethnicity, the extent to which people saw the importance or rated the importance of arts and culture increased during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. And the boxes, the kind of dotted boxes, show the race or ethnicities where that difference between before and during is statistically significant. So that's true for many of these groups. I will say that one of the most surprising findings we're seeing in Wave 2 so far is the fact that the overall level for this rating of the importance of arts and culture has jumped up really significantly to 56% from 40% of people during COVID and 37% of people before COVID. That's something we want to explore and understand further, but a really interesting demonstration of the power of arts and culture over the past year for people. And then I want to acknowledge the fact that we asked about a fairly wide range of arts and culture activities, trying to get a sense of how deeply and where and how people were connecting with arts and culture activities before the pandemic. And the Black or African Americans stood out as being less likely than other racial or ethnic groups to have participated in at least one of the cultural activities on this list of like 36 different things that we included. But among those cultural activities who were doing some kind of cultural activity, the frequency of participation didn't vary by any race or ethnicity. And the thing that we took away from this is the idea that the assumption of decreased cultural participation among BIPOC Americans really doesn't hold. And the fact that we saw Black or African Americans as less likely to select one of these activities told us that we didn't have the right list. We needed to broaden that list, and that was one of the areas we really wanted to explore with qualitative research. Finally, I'm going to talk about the bigger tent of digital engagement and the evidence for that we're seeing in this data. So this chart shows both awareness in the bolder columns and use of online arts or culture activities as of 1 month or 45 days into the pandemic. And so this shows that the majority of Americans, 76%, were aware of at least one online or digital cultural activity during the pandemic, and a little over half of Americans had done one of those things within the last 30 days. And that awareness and use doesn't vary very much across race and ethnicity. We have slightly lower awareness levels among Black or African Americans, but usage levels are the same as the overall there. One of the things we really wanted to explore here was the extent to which digital might be engaging a community that's broader than the sort of usual suspects, the people who are coming through the doors of arts and culture organizations in person in 2019. So we thought about this as kind of a Venn diagram where we're overlapping people going in person before the pandemic in 2019 to those who had used some kind of online arts or culture digital content through an arts or culture organization within the past month at that point. And we're curious about like where we might see people who are only doing in person and not engaging online, where we see the overlap of those who are doing both, and then most crucially, where there might be people who are engaging online who hadn't been in person to any of the genres of arts and culture previously. And found really interesting stuff here. So these little donut charts demonstrate the extent to which the people who are engaging in online arts or culture through these types of organizations had been previously to an arts or culture activity in 2019 of that type versus those who had not. And we see that for dance groups, the majority of people engaging online hadn't been to any in-person dance performances in 2019. That's at 55%. And it ranges down to 35% for classical music group. This is just 4 of, I think, 11 or 12 different categories that we measured, but we picked out some of the performing arts ones to share with you today. And then perhaps most important, it's taking the next step in this and trying to think about, are those people that online arts or culture organizations are engaging different along any behavioral or demographic dimensions that would be helpful or important for us to know about? And one of the things that we noticed here was that within some art forms, there's a much greater proportion of digital-only users who weren't going in person, who are Black or African American, than among digital users who had recently attended in person, signifying that the people who you're engaging who didn't already walk through your doors are more diverse along dimensions that are typically underrepresented in formal art and culture activities. And that was true for Black or African Americans, which we're highlighting here, but also for Hispanic or Latinx Americans, for those with lower incomes, and for those with lower education levels in certain genres. And the bars here just demonstrate to what extent there is a jump in the proportion of people online within these categories who are participating who hadn't been in person previously. And so we can see pretty big fold increases from, about 8% of those who had attended a jazz music performance and were using online content, up to almost 38% of those who were online only users who were Black or African American. Much more detailed tables about this in our full report too, if you're interested in more. Okay, and that's it for me. Welcome questions or comments about anything that's surprising, but I will mute myself and pass it over to you, Melody.
Thank you, Jen. So Jen kind of set the stage pretty well about how this qualitative project came to be, which was basically based on the findings of the first wave, but also some additional goals that we wanted to kind of achieve. So next slide, please. Thank you. So in this part of the presentation, I first would like to kind of touch on, again, how this phase of the project came to be, and then touch on some preliminary findings and insights, and then kind of open the floor for discussion and questions. So next slide, please. Yes. So our main goal basically here was kind of the overarching goal was to help the cultural sector or any other sector that brings people together around the arts and culture better understand the dynamics of equity and relevance. So to this end, in this specific phase, we really wanted to focus on the perspectives of Black and African American participants. One of the reasons why is, like Jen mentioned, there were really unique findings related to Black and African American participants in the Centering the Picture report. The second one is also kind of the societal changes we have been going through and kind of movement towards racial justice during that time, especially concerning Black people in the United States. So that's another reason why we focused on this group. So just like Jen touched on earlier, although I'm representing a broader team here on my own, I wasn't alone. So I worked with the core team of my colleagues Tanya Treptov, Camila Guerrero, and Ciara Knight, as well as our key collaborators, Katrina Bledsoe, who helped us through the research process, Yancey Consulting and LaPlaca Cohen, who collaborated with us as thought partners. And we also talked to some organizations who were really embedded in their communities to make sure that they're part of this research process, and they help us kind of co-create the types of topics that we explore and the types of questions that we ask. So another caveat before we kind of dive into the results is that these are preliminary findings. So this is kind of a moment of initial reflection rather than the full picture, but later in the summer, earlier in the fall, we will have a full report as well, which will be deeper than what I present today. So another thing to keep in mind is that we really wanted to prioritize an intersectional framework so that we can make sure that different identities and different backgrounds within the Black community are represented in the people that we spoke to. But then at the same time, we only talked to 50 people. So this report and this presentation today is not going to claim to be a comprehensive view of all Black experiences or all Black communities within the United States, but it will be just the voices, amplifying the voices of the people that we spoke to. And yes, so next is basically how did we reach out to these 50 people and how our process kind of unfolded. So we recruited participants through 3 different methods. The first method is basically the CCTC report that Jen presented on earlier. So we reached out to some participants who agreed to be contacted for another phase of research. And that was useful because we were able to ensure that we have people from different backgrounds represented. We have people from different kind of levels of engagement are represented. And then the second method was people who basically through a professional recruiter. So people who sign up to do research, but they are a little more representative of the US population. And again, there's a little more control over kind of who is part of this project so that we can ensure more representation. And then the third one was basically through our community connected organizations and their referrals. And that group was smaller compared to the other 2 that I mentioned, just to keep that in mind as well. And another thing to keep in mind is that we did use Zoom and phone to reach out to people and talk to people, and we did email people. So people who might not have had access, so people who are maybe on the across the digital divide might not have been as represented as the people who did. So each conversation took about 90 minutes or so, and we took breaks at times, but mostly they were 90 minutes long. And we really wanted to keep the conversations conversational. So they weren't necessarily hierarchical or in an interview setting, but we really brought our personalities and our personal lives even into the conversations. So we spent about 20 to 30 minutes of these 90 minutes building rapport with our participants. So we talked about ourselves. And another thing that will be important here is that there were 2 researchers in the conversation and a participant. And the researcher who talked the most was Black and African American, and the people who tended to take notes were not Black and African American. And we did that to kind of research in the field has shown that if people are in a conversation where they are talking to, especially Black people, when they're talking to other Black people, if any traumatic experiences come up, the conversations can become more productive and a little more therapeutic compared to somebody who is white who is interviewing them. So that was one of the reasons why. And similarly, we really wanted to ensure openness, comfort, and trust. So if people didn't feel comfortable, they felt free to leave the conversation, which did not happen, but they were free to do so, or take breaks at any time that they wanted. And then finally, we were really intentional in the way that we led participants into the conversation or the words that we used. So for example, we didn't use the phrases such as arts and culture, because we wanted to really see the broad range of activities that people did without kind of bringing up any connotation the phrase arts and culture might have. So just like Jen touched on earlier, we really wanted to kind of expand that definition. So that's why we didn't explicitly mention those words. Another word that we didn't use was, for example, belonging, because it can be a pretty complex topic. So we really allow participants to bring things on their own. That's great, Jen, because we can move on to the findings. So the first one is regarding well-being. And again, this really overlaps with what Jen talked about earlier. And just to set the context, at the beginning of every conversation, we ask people, okay, this has been an emotional roller coaster, maybe, you know, what has been keeping you sane during this time? And a lot of people talked about kind of a really broad range of emotions. So a lot of positive emotions and a lot of negative emotions. So joy and self-reflection and care, but also grief and anger and sadness, but also healing. And some people highlighted the role of cultural organizations during this time. So if we can move on to the next slide, I can give you an example. So this is a participant who felt like they did not have an avenue to heal and grief. When they turned to their friends and family, they really wanted to kind of avoid that conversation. But there was a digital event through an arts organization that offered a healing session, a grief session. And that was very, very beneficial for them. So they attended, and there was facilitation, it was on Zoom, there was meditation, singing, chanting, and they were able to get something that they couldn't really find in their life through that event, through an arts organization. And we will be sharing these slides so you can read the quotes fully, but I won't be reading them today for time concerns, but this kind of exemplifies that. That's perfectly fine, Jen. It kind of exemplifies that arts and culture can serve a very unique role in helping people process emotions and come together around those emotions and connect to each other. So the next one is regarding creativity and self-expression. So as we talk to people about what has been keeping them sane during this time, a lot of creative activities came up. So we included self-expression here as well, because for some people, when we talked about creativity, their initial response was, I'm not creative. Yet when we asked about the expression, they talked about a lot of creative activities. So then we started talking about both of these terms, because self-expression resonated with some and creativity resonated with others. And it really played a major role in people's lives, especially in connecting to, in connection at 3 levels. So one would be connecting to one's deeper self and connecting to one's core. The other would be kind of the upper level where you connect to others and your close family and friends. And then the other one would be connecting to the broader world. So people really talked about each and every level of connection. And if we can move on to the next slide, there are multiple ways in which people talked about creativity and self-expression, and thinking about arts and culture. These could be certain kind of entry points into affirming and celebrating people's creativity through the arts. So the first one was basically expression through more traditionally defined artistic practice and arts-based crafts, arts and crafts. And the second one is more so the act of physical creation. So we had people who talked about during this time creating murals in their houses, or creating, kind of working on woodworking. So trying out new things and creating something that they can hold in their hands and kind of feeling that sense of accomplishment. And the next one was at kind of a higher level. So not just creating something physical, but also generating new thoughts, ideas, and creative connections. A lot of people talked about writing books and reimagining new worlds, and then bouncing these ideas off of other people and then coming up with new ideas. So that kind of creativity was really important as well. And the next one is about documenting and preserving authentic history. A lot of people talked about keeping journals during this time, or reading the journals of their parents, of their grandparents, and then passing that on to their kids for the next generation. So this again speaks to that connection aspect. And some also talked about documenting protests, for example, during this time, and passing that on to not only their families and friends, but also using that as inspiration within the community. And then the next one is about the embodiment of creativity. So some people that we talked to actually said that I do not need to do anything that is kind of creative on its own, because as a Black person, the way I talk, the way I dress, the way I express myself is an art in itself. So the way I do my hair, this is an art in itself, and this is a product of my creativity. So I embody it rather than kind of do it. So all of these kind of come together as potential entry points into how to affirm these creative and self-expressive entry points. So next slide, please. So the next two are going to be about kind of trust and trustworthiness and welcome and belonging. And I will also touch on some potential lessons that we can learn from these concepts and kind of applying it in arts and culture field and beyond. So we did separate trust and trustworthiness for this reason. So if you go to Google or any academic source and write Black people and trust, the results that come up are usually Black people's mistrust or Black people's lack of trust or the trust gap for Black people. Yet, although the results show some differences in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of trust, a lot of these studies and news reports focus on kind of trust in people, but not necessarily trustworthiness that results in that trust. And it really places the burden of trust onto Black people and Black communities. So in our research, we really wanted to focus on how trustworthiness leads to trust. So we focused on trustworthiness over trust. So for many, actually this was affirmed because they did separate trust and trustworthiness. And they talked about how trustworthiness is this end result and it's dynamic and provisional and built over time. And it's also evidence-based. So if there was something that is signaled to me that I found not trustworthy, then I might kind of update the way I trust an organization, for example, or a person in a person. So this was very key to how trustworthiness and trust kind of communicated. Other things that people talked about, especially in terms of kind of organizational settings, is recognition and accountability to the past. So for example, if an organization has some problematic behavior that was reported in the media, for example, they didn't want to give up on that organization necessarily, unless it was something really big. So, but they really wanted to see how that organization will recognize what they did wrong and how they held themselves accountable. And then the next one was kind of meaningful actions. So not only how they recognized it, but also what they did for to acknowledge what went wrong. And in this context, we asked people about the many Black Lives Matter statements that organizations sent to people. And unanimously, people said that they don't care about these statements. And they said that what's really important is the actions behind those words. So I would like to see the board members of that organization, who is making the decisions, who is in this organization, who's coming into the doors of that organization. So that was much more key than any statement that they could have seen. And then the next one is about consistent community presence and support. So consistency is key here. We asked people, okay, during this time, who did you see show up for the community? And community could range from their neighborhood or immediate circle or just their region, for example. And what came to mind was not arts and cultural organizations. People actually talked about organizations that served an immediate need. So for example, they talked about food shelters, homeless shelters and food banks. And or organizations that really pivoted during this time. So if a library, for example, is opening its doors for the broader community and allocating, for example, a room for childcare services, that was something that was really appreciated. And next, we have some examples, but I will skip that. And I already kind of touched on them, but you can read them after the presentation. So I'll touch
There's
on
some
the
really good ones here. Melody, do you want to read one of them? I think we have
Okay.
enough time.
Okay, maybe I can read then, I don't know which one. I can read the second one maybe because I kind of explained it, but this really exemplifies that point. So this person said, some of these organizations I work with, they posted these Black Lives Matter statements, but I don't think that's true in some situations. So because you look at their staff, their board, if your mission is serving the general population, then that needs to be represented on the staff. So you need that cultural expertise on your staff in order to be effective at cultural presentation. So what really mattered was behind the scenes rather than kind of the optics or what was kind of visible to people, which will be kind of relevant in the next section. So keep that in mind. So just for the, oh no, go ahead. That's great, thank you. So just to think about the key takeaways and the lessons for trust and trustworthiness, attendance did not necessarily mean trust. So the quote that I didn't read actually was about this lesson, because there was a person, for example, who said that they love museums. They go to museums every week, they love it. But then when we asked about whether or not they found museums trustworthy, they said, that's not the context for trust for me, because they felt like it was almost like a cognitive dissonance. They held these conflicting views in mind at the same time. So although they loved museums, they were also aware of kind of problematic practices and histories within museums. And they wanted to kind of push museums because they believed in the value of museums, but then at the same time, it wasn't really a space of trustworthiness for them. So just because somebody is coming through the doors does not mean that this organization is trustworthy. The next one is aiming for progress and not perfection. This was acknowledged pretty often too. People talked about giving grace to organizations. So if an organization is really trying hard, but then they fail in some way, but then they acknowledge and try to move forward, that was really appreciated. So almost like if you make a mistake and you fail, try harder and fail better next time, but keep going and don't give up. Next one was about a commitment to a long-term process. So acknowledging that building trust and signaling trustworthiness is not overnight, and it might take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So just normalizing that. And next one I touched on, the fact that you need to kind of show that commitment and not just tell, and do so consistently. And finally, forming mutually beneficial alliances and collaborations with other trusted entities. So this could be people or this could be organizations, but making sure that you highlight solidarity because we're kind of all in this together. And finally, this section about welcome and belonging, similarly to trust and trustworthiness, there's again a differentiation between these concepts. So as we talk to people, people really separated what belonging was from welcome. Belonging was more internal to people. People said that they create belonging wherever they go. So they're not necessarily in spaces of belonging, but feeling welcome in a space can foster a sense of belonging. So they're linked, although they're not exactly the same thing. And what was the kind of key word here is authenticity. So if a person is able to express themselves authentically in a space, then that space became a space of belonging. But then the first step would be to kind of foster welcome in an environment, and then belonging comes next. So then how do we foster welcome in an environment? So one way would be through visible and invisible cues, or implicit or explicit cues. So explicit cues could be like a sign that says Black Lives Matter, for example, or rainbow flags, or just having something that's really visual, or seeing other Black people in that space. An invisible cue is so much more subtle, yet it's as loud as the visible cue. So for example, if you go to a space and there's programming for Black people or about Black people, and you read the explanation and you can tell that the narrative is not coming from a Black person, then that was a cue of unwelcome, because it communicated to people that, okay, Black people are not involved in the decision-making process, and this is just for the optics. And that was not genuine. The next one is presenting holistic narratives. So although, especially more recently, there's a lot of content about Black people and Black history, and this was appreciated, but then at the same time, people felt overwhelmed about just the oversaturation of trauma stories about pain and suffering and slavery and police brutality. And people really wanted to see that holistic experience of what it means to be Black. So joy and connection and happiness, all the other things that goes in our lives. So where are these stories? So there was a very, there was a desire expressed for these holistic narratives. And the next one is about bringing margins to the center. So when a Black person is doing something on the margins and pushing the boundaries and innovating, people really wanted that to be forefront rather than being othered. So one person, for example, said that in classical music, if there is somebody, a Black artist who does something different, then they're told that they don't belong in classical music, but they're doing something else, like they're doing neoclassical. But if a white person does something else, something very similar, then they're called somebody who blazes trails. So they really wanted that gap to be closed and just Black innovation to be celebrated. So next slide, please. So in speaking of belonging, the first person said that they belong here because their ancestors built this country. And sometimes, although they have the sense of belonging, sometimes the environment tells them or makes them feel like they do not belong. And then in those spaces, they create belonging and they affirm belonging. So that's how they saw these degrees of and layers of belonging for themselves. So you might not feel it in a space, but then you have to create it yourself. So it is so much more internal than external. And next, about the lessons or key takeaways to learn from this. And next slide, please. Yes, so how do we foster these welcoming environments? So one would be to have representation at every step of the process. So not just having Black workers in the front lines, but having Black artists and Black administrators and Black thinkers and philosophers and academics, everybody involved in the process. The next one was actually to, although you can involve people, but make sure that this is a broad representation and not tokenism. So people pointed out the fact that sometimes they see Black people celebrated, but it's always the same people who show up over and over and over again. And that felt like they just chose one person who was palatable and just kind of paraded around for the optics rather than what they can bring to the table. So kind of diversity, celebrating diversity in Black communities and artistry. The next one is we call good customer service, because this was pretty key. People really talked about kind of small gestures of kindness. And that was really important, because if you're Black in a space and somebody is rude to you, a white person or a non-Black person is rude to you, you always have to have these mental gymnastics about, was that just rude or was that racist? So it's kind of a risk that people should not take, because it's always nice, obviously, to be kind to people, but especially in terms of kind of these racial relations, it rudeness communicates so much more, and it makes a space so much more unwelcome than it might be for another person who is not Black. And the next two are actually very similar to what I talked about, which is celebrating a wide variety of Black experiences and embracing Black visionaries without othering people. So I will pause here and thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. And we don't have a lot of time, but hopefully we can answer some questions.
Melody and Jen, thank you so much for such a rich conversation. And I'll be fully transparent. At one point during the conversation, Melody, I found myself getting emotional. And I was so taken aback by that. I'm like, why am I having an emotional response to this? But I'll say that I think I felt incredibly seen as a person of color. And I think that that's really a testament to the richness that you brought to this, to your research. I mean, just so many layers. And, you know, I just wanted to say that in full transparency, but also to say that I think that's really, that's not often the case. So thank you for the care and the deep listening that you brought to your work and how you so aptly explained it and represented it. So we have time for questions. I had a lot of questions, but I do wonder, you know, for those that are with us, what surprised you in this conversation, or what resonated for you, you know, for those that are in this space or online? I would invite for you to put that in the chat if you'd like. That would be great. I definitely heard a lot of other themes here. I loved the theme of entry points. I loved the theme of trustworthiness over trust, which I thought was really an amazing idea. And it seems like transparency was a very big sort of underlying theme in much of what you shared. But I guess I have some, so I'll invite people to put questions in the chat.
You just muted yourself, Krista. There you go.
Right?
Yep.
The slides will be shared with the community, Michael. Thank you for bringing that up. One question that we got was, thank you for the insightful presentation. I was wondering if the lack of importance attached to arts and culture activities in the Black and Native communities during COVID is related to the health disparities experienced by those communities. And I'm not sure if I'm going to, I'm not even going to try to pronounce Ms. or Mr. Lee's name. So
I'm gonna guess Shuey, but please correct us if that's incorrect here. It's a really great question. So I think there are two data points that this might touch on. One is about the ratings for importance of arts and culture organizations, both before this crisis and during this crisis. And if we look at that, Black or African Americans are actually fairly in line with the overall ratings there. So the importance for them, 39% selected a 4 or 5 on that 5-point scale for importance during COVID versus 37% for the overall population. And so I think that there's not a huge difference there, which is interesting, even though we see that there is a greater proportion of Black or African Americans who hadn't done any of the activities on that list. So that may be what you're referring to, that 12% of Black or African Americans who hadn't done any of the in-person activities before COVID in 2019 that we listed. I will say that we expanded that list really significantly, informed by the conversations that Melody and the qualitative team had with Black or African Americans to make sure that we were including a broader set of arts or culture activities, and that finding actually doesn't carry through for wave 2. So I actually see that as a failure of the research and less an indication of the extent to which Black or African Americans might be having different, although they were having different experiences, many of them during COVID with respect to economic impacts and health disparities that we know about. I don't know that it's showing up in this question in that way.
Thanks, Jen. I do wonder about some of the promises or hopefulness, I guess, that sort of emerged in the research. And I just thinking about to the very beginning of your conversation, thinking about digital programming, and that's fascinating. You know, that there were that many people, particularly for dance. You know, that folks who maybe have never stepped foot into a theater to see dance, but were intrigued by and attracted to the digital realm. What promise do you see the digital programming might hold for engaging more BIPOC community members in arts and culture, and how might we lean into that, particularly for as an entry point, as you said, or the digital door, and then sort of bringing them on a rampway or a highway that kind of brings them into the main stage. What are your thoughts about that?
Can I add some qualitative nuance to it? So
Please.
yes, that was actually one of the things that I found really interesting in this research process, because we thought that maybe something about digital experiences was really unique, that it attracted so many people who hadn't done those activities. Yet when we talked to people, and even people who said that they hadn't done a lot of stuff in person that they had done digitally, most people said that they actually prefer in person over digital, which was really interesting to hear. And the reason for that is that they said that it does not necessarily replace in person, because you can have the same level of connection to people and to the content. But then at the same time, for some people, especially those who are seeking some opportunities in the art sector, they found so many more opportunities. So we had actors and actresses who resided in one part of the country, but they were able to really audition, like somebody in New York was able to audition in LA without having to fly there, without having to spend money, or without having to spend any other resources. Or they were able to connect and network with other artists. So that's really opened doors to a lot of kind of younger creators. And that was something that we heard that was really interesting. And also although we didn't hear as much about this, but it also is something important for participants with disabilities. They were able to access more stuff. So we had one person, for example, who had a lot of back issues and they couldn't move at all, but they were able to do so much more at home than they could have done in person because they couldn't walk.
Yeah.
So I'll pass it on to Jen.
Yeah, it's such a pivotal question, I think, for the future of the sector. And I don't know that we have definitive answers yet. I think we have some hope. And I like the way that you framed it, Krista, just around the potential for digital to engage, to be a doorway, and not necessarily a lesser doorway or path to connection with arts or culture, or not even a stepping stone to the valued in-person relationship, the way that some arts and culture organizations have conceptualized it. We'll just have them engage digitally and then they'll come to us. Like, that may not need to be the goal. And so we have a lot to unpack here from the Wave 2 research, but the preliminary findings seem to demonstrate that across the year of the pandemic, these findings really held, that people were engaging in arts and culture activities that they hadn't done in the past few years, and that those individuals who were doing that, who hadn't come in person, were more diverse along important dimensions. I think what comes next is the critical piece, right? And we see in the survey too that people expect that they're going to prefer in person, most people, but that leaves up to 30% of the US population who either prefer digital or prefer them equally, and may have access issues for a variety of reasons: geographic, ability focused, financial. So I think that there's still a lot to explore here about what that future is going to look like. One thing I will say that I'm fascinated by is the fact that when we asked people about what was important to them in that online connection over the last year, we heard really overwhelmingly that connecting to places, organizations, and art in places that they couldn't get to physically or geographically was huge. Over 60% of people said that was really important to them, compared to about 30% who said that connecting with their local organizations online mattered. So it does seem like there's a dimension of accessing worlds that you might not have access to otherwise that digital opens up.
I love that. Well, for all of us working in the arts, we know that it's such a gateway to opening up worlds and empathy and perspectives that we may not have. So this is, I see all the things that you just touched on as really intrinsic to what we do. And the fact that this pandemic provided increased access for people to tap into that is amazing. And how do we make sure that we don't lose that? Because that's, I appreciated Lori's question about, when you showed the Venn diagram, did you notice that the digital dance audience who had not attended live, did you see them as a potential new audience for in-person? But it sounds like maybe or maybe not, because some people really liked seeing it and it was wonderful and it was connection. And some people were like, but I maybe want to see something new. Is there anything else that you would add to that, or was that further investigated in terms of people that had never been maybe showing an interest in coming to in-person performances?
I'm curious, Melody, if you heard anything about this in the qualitative. I feel like that's the question for a survey in May 2022, yeah. Right? Like, what happened? Did people, once you're able to engage online or in person again, how did people make that trade-off? And did some of the barriers that prevented in-person engagement previously, did they, kind of maintain once you get over that joyful explosion of being able to do this again? I do think that many of those barriers won't have gone away, and so it's a really good question. I just want to provoke or sort of push on the idea that digital is only useful as a pathway towards that. I don't think that's what Lori was saying, but I think it's been framed as lesser than in a lot of contexts, and want to think about how do we flip that paradigm potentially.
Understood. Really good point. Let's see, we have a couple of questions here. Other questions?
There's one from Edward. Can I address that one?
Yes, please.
Great.
I'm glad you could see this. This is great.
Yeah, about cultural or artistic experiences, including going to church. And we did. We had one of the options for past in-person engagement with culture was church, temple, mosque, or other spiritual expression. And that one we are seeing varies pretty significantly across different parts of the country demographically, but particularly for Black or African Americans.
What about this question from Michael Alexander? Were the members of the, oops, why am I muted again? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Were the members of the BIPOC community that were interviewed being interviewed by members of the BIPOC community, which I think you might have actually answered, right? You talked about the qualitative interviewees and the interviewers being mixed, but the person that was really in the lead kind of engagement role was always a BIPOC person. Is that right?
Yes, it was. So all of our participants were Black. So we made sure that the interviewer is also Black. So it was myself and Sierra Knight. So we were the main interviewers, or conversants rather. And then we had note takers, and they were not Black. So that's kind of the roles that we had. And this combination always changed. So some interviews were only a Black note taker and a Black interviewer, and some were Black interviewer and non-Black note taker. So there was a mix.
Great, thank you. Given all that we've talked about, I wonder how how might the data inform our presenters' programming, engagement and communication strategies moving forward, which feels like a very loaded and very big question. So I just want to acknowledge that that's the case. But I wonder what your thoughts are on next steps for organizations or individuals that work with presenters and artists who want to take in this information and figure out how they might respond to it. What would be some of your thoughts about that?
I have a good example for this. So one of the participants gave this example in a conversation. They said that they lived in a community where the neighborhood really loved a basketball court. They came together to watch, their children and celebrate things there and just support people. And there was an organization who saw this and they thought, great, people really value this space. So what we can do is to raise money and make this space state of the art, amazing space, and people will love it. So they did so. They created this huge court, and it was closed and had doors, and everything was new. And they opened the doors, and nobody came. So the reason for that is that the reason why people really value that space was because they could celebrate and they could come together. But when it was an enclosed space, there were space limitations. So people couldn't actually come together. It was for maybe 20 people. So it no longer had that impact on people. And the lesson to learn from here is that as an organization, it's very vital to not assume things about what a community wants and needs, but just ask that community what they would prefer and what they value and how they can be helpful, rather than kind of coming in and trying to, even with good intentions, kind of trying to assert what they think they will need. So that was a nice lesson, maybe to learn for everybody about kind of co-creation.
Yeah, that's a great example, and you know, that co-curation and programming is a really important theme that we're seeing even in our field, that you can't have all that perspective. You do need multiple perspectives on the work and that inclusion in that. So thank you for underscoring that. We're hitting our ending point, so I just want to check if there's any other last minute questions, but then also give you an opportunity to tell us what's next, you know, in terms of these being preliminary qualitative, well, at least Melody's section being preliminary qualitative findings. What's the next step for the full report? And also, are there any plans that reflect what you brought up, Jen? It would be great to do a 2022 report on, well, what happened, you know, now that we're all back in person, and how are we doing and how are we feeling about our arts and cultural organizations? Can you share what we can expect?
Yeah, Melody, do you want to do next steps for the qual? And I can talk a little bit about the Wave 2 quant.
Sure. So as of now, actually, we are working on that report, and it will be available hopefully end of the summer, and it will be on our website, and it will most likely be a longer, very long report, but it will be very deep and exciting, hopefully. So we will be very excited to share it with all of you, and yeah, we will keep you posted, and I will hand it over to Jen to talk about the broader picture.
Yeah, so there will be 2 reports coming out of this most recent wave of quantitative research. One that LaPlaca Cohen is really taking the lead on, that will be coming out at the end of fall, and that will be a very visual presentation style, key takeaways level report that really gets at the gist of the kind of action steps coming out of this research. So hopefully very useful and accessible to people. The Slover Linett team, the kind of wonky researchers amongst us, will be writing a more detailed kind of policy level report that goes into much more depth, particularly around race and ethnicity as a lens to look at this entire survey through again, the way that we did for Wave 1. And that will be coming out late in the fall. And we'll include some comparisons across the waves too, so that we can contextualize some of those findings where we have the same questions 1 year apart. And there's a place on our website, sloverlinett.com/CCTT, I believe, where you can sign up to be kind of just kept in the loop about reports as they become available.
Great, thank you. And just before we go, I think see Karen's comments here. In looking at the path from digital to live, you spoke of such barriers as geographic, physical resources. Aren't we also addressing the barriers that you discussed in the qualitative section, belonging, welcome, representation?
So helpful, so important. Yeah, I mean, the content matters so deeply and extensively, and the form matters too. There's so much there, but you have to be programming things that are relevant to your community, no matter whether or not they're being engaged with online or in person. And so yes, 100%.
Thank you, Karen, for underscoring that. It's, it's not one or the other, it's multiple layers, it's long-term, it's transparent, it's internal and external, it's a human commitment. So with that, I just want to thank you both for presenting such wonderful data and insight and giving us a lot to think about. I am going to go ahead and invite you now to come back, and maybe with your colleagues at LaPlaca Cohen, if all the research is happening, is going to be finishing up and ready at the end of fall. That's a great time for us to raise that up with our conference coming in January. So we look forward to having you be a part of that. That would be lovely. And so thank you again to the two of you and to Slover Linett in general for your work. Thank you to the Wallace Foundation for your awesome partnership and for both seeding this data and also being such a wonderful communications partner and funding partner to APAP and to our presenting field as we look at how we can make better and stronger connections to our community. Thanks for all of you who joined today. The recording will be available on our website very soon. And please look out for our upcoming events on the APAP website, apap365.org. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, Melody and Jen. Take good care.
Bye.